I'm Sarah from Sourdough for Beginners. I am going to mix up the beginner bread recipe. So if you've never seen one of these lives before, this is the recipe that we recommend all beginners who encounter it try to use. It's really simple. It's got a set of essential processes. So there's like basic stuff that we think that you can follow, and it's going to help you get a perfect loaf every time. I'm just going to pop my earbuds in so you can hear me better. Bear with me for 1 sec. Let's see. Perfect. Okay, should be able to hear me good with my buds in. Okay, so I'm going to mix up the beginner bread recipe. So the Easter festivities are over. I've been making discard recipes galore. I'm now completely out of sourdough. So the beginner bread recipe is designed to be simple and easy and has just the essential processes. So it's taken everything that's easy about sourdough and put it all into one process to follow. So here's my starter. She's nice and bubbly and active and ready to go. The beginner bread recipe calls for 120 grams of starter, and the level 2 hydration recipe calls for 200 grams of starter. I'm going to do the level 2 hydration, but I'll save the beginner bread recipe as we go. So I've got my bowl on a scale. I'm going to tear my scale to 0, and I'm going to scoop 200 grams of starter into this bowl. If you're a brand new beginner, we recommend that you start with the beginner bread recipe, which is 120 grams of starter. It's a lower hydration recipe. It's good for beginners to start with a low hydration recipe because it's easier to manage. It proofs slower, right? It's just a little bit easier on you when you don't necessarily understand what the processes are and what order they should come in. So I've got 200 grams of starter here in my bowl. My starter is being very sticky today. I did just take the starter straight out of the fridge. So my process with my starter is that I use it in my bread. As soon as I'm done mixing my bread, I refeed my starter. I let it double on the counter. And then once it's doubled, I stick it in the fridge. I bake every 2 or 3 days, so I can often just pull my starter right out of the fridge. Once you put it in the fridge, it slows down the fermentation, so it often stays at peak or just starts to slightly fall inside the fridge. So I'll pull it straight out of the fridge and use it. If you bake less often than me, if you bake once a week, then you might want to not feed your starter after you're done mixing. Just stick it in the fridge when you're done, and then pull it out 4 to 12 hours before you bake. Get it fed, let it double on the counter, and then use it as soon as it's doubled. We can use our starter at or after peak. The longer past peak, the more sour flavor you get. So I've got 200 grams of starter in here. If you were using the beginner bread recipe, you would have 120 grams. I'm now going to add 700 grams of water. If you were using the beginner bread recipe, you would use 680. So just slightly less water. It just makes it a little bit less sticky, a little stiffer, a little bit easier to manage. So I'm just going to get my 700 grams in here. After this live is over, I will paste all of the links to all of the recipes and the essential processes that we teach in the comments of this live. They're also all over the Big Sourdough for Beginners group if you're watching through that, and they're pinned at the top of the Sourdough for Beginners page. They're everywhere. So if you haven't ever encountered this before, if you haven't ever seen it, don't worry, I'll make sure you've got everything you need. This is me just doing what we're teaching people to do so that you can see it being done. So I've got 200 grams of starter in my bowl. I've got 700 grams of water in my bowl. I'm going to blend them together with a whisk. So I'm just going to keep whisking until my starter completely dissolves and creates like sort of a foamy, milky substance. The next thing I'm going to put in is 1,000 grams of flour. Carlene, oh my gosh, thank you so much. I love it. Carlene just sent me stars. I really appreciate those, and I'm glad you're here. So the next ingredient is 1,000 grams of flour. You can use any blend of flour that you want. If you're a beginner, we recommend that you don't go over 20% sturdy flour. So sturdy flours are whole wheat, rye, einkorn, spelt. We do recommend if you want to add a little bit to get some flavor in there, do it. But those sturdier flours are a little harder to work with. They require a little bit higher hydration and they proof faster. So the whole point of the beginner bread recipe is let's make everything simple so that beginners can practice. So practice with this at first. Start with very low hydration, very basic flour, and of course they're way less expensive as well, right? So if it doesn't go right the first or second or eighth time, you're not wasting extremely expensive rye flour, right? Practice the processes. Feed your starter, make sure it's active, mix up your bread recipe, stretch and fold, 30 minutes rest, then stretch and fold 4 times. Let your dough bulk proof on the counter somewhere between 4 and 8 hours in clear, straight-sided containers so that you can watch it. Wait for it to go to double. Pre-shape it, shape it, score it, bake it all the same day. Skip cold proofing. Cold proofing is great, but it's an optional process. Just practice these things for your first couple of loaves until you're comfortable. Then start adding in more advanced or optional processes. So an optional process is cold proofing. If you're going to cold proof, that's fantastic. You absolutely should. But in that case, you're only going to let your dough grow to say 75% instead of 100% because it grows more in the fridge, right? A more advanced process might be using way more sturdy flour, so 50% or 100% whole wheat. And we do have videos on YouTube that sort of take you through how to do all of those things. Another advanced process is creating a levain from your starter, controlling how your starter is going to act within the bread. Another one is auto-leasing, where we pre-mix our flour and water before we start the process. We add our salt later. All of these things are good techniques, but they're a little bit more complicated than you need as a beginner. So here's my starter. My starter and water. It's all blended together. And I've got pre-measured 1,000 grams of flour. Usually when I do these lives, I measure them into the bowl, but I pre-measured it today and I'll tell you why. Every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern, so 42 minutes from now, I'm going live on an app called Starcam. And the reason I chose this app is because it lets you guys come in and ask questions. So I've got the link to it in the description of this video. You might be able to see it on the bottom, or there's shareable links somewhere. Let me see if I can pop this up. This one, show. So it's, you can come into Starcam and you can actually create a video. You can show me your dough. You can show me your bread and say, hey, look, this happened. What's wrong? You can ask your questions directly and we can interact together. So if you like these lives and you want to come in and ask some questions or hear other people ask questions and answer them, then after this live ends, quickly download the app. It's free and come in and ask me some questions. I'd love to see you there. So this is 1,000 grams of flour. For me, it's about 850 grams of regular bleached all-purpose flour and 150 grams of a beautiful organic spelt by Bob's Red Mill. So I'm just going to get the flour all into the bowl, and then I'm going to tare my scale back to 0 and get 20 grams of salt in there. So I just pour my salt right on top until I get to 20 grams. There we go. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is use my spoon as long as I can to get the starter water mix to soak into the flour. So I'll stir with the spoon at first until the flour is kind of absorbed as much of the liquid as the spoon will let me do. And then I'll use my hand to finish mixing the dough. So when we first do our mix, we want a shaggy dough. So we want to kind of mix it as well as we can. But during that first mix, it's pretty tough. It's pretty rare that you get the dough like fully incorporated, but that's okay. This is what stretching and folding is for. So if you've ever made yeast bread before, you mix up your dough and then you knead it for somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes. Or if you're using a stand mixer, you let your dough hook do it. Sourdough is very sticky, and it's supposed to be. The fun part about sourdough is determining good sticky and bad sticky. Like, what's exactly the right level of sticky? And this is where beginners start to really struggle, is understanding what sticky is normal and what sticky is too sticky. Stretching and folding comes directly after mixing, and it builds strength in the bread. It's basically a more gentle form of kneading than you would use for a yeast bread. So when you first mix your dough, like I'm doing right now, you don't really have to worry too much if your dough isn't very well mixed, because you're going to do a total of 4 stretch and folds with 30 minutes rest in between. As you get more experienced in sourdough, you'll start to understand what the right amount of strength is. You'll be able to feel it in your dough. As you're stretching and folding, you'll be able to feel the dough resisting you. You'll be able to see it getting smoother. You'll see air starting to incorporate in there. You'll be able to pick your dough up and actually see the elasticity in it. When we stretch and fold, what we're doing is building strength into our dough. And so for beginners, what we say is, stretching and folding is an essential process. You shouldn't skip it, and don't worry about knowing exactly how your dough is supposed to feel, because at first you can just say, I'll do 4 sets of stretch and folds, and I'm confident that's enough strength. After we're done stretching and folding, what we're going to do is transfer our dough into clear, straight-sided containers like this. Anything that's got straight sides and is about 2.5 times the size of your dough is going to let you see your dough as it rises. And like I said, if you're cold proofing, let it rise to 75%. If you're not cold proofing, let it rise to 100%. And we recommend that just for the first couple of loaves, beginners skip that cold proofing step if they can. What we recommend for your very first loaf is that you feed your starter before bed, get up early in the morning, mix your dough, get through your stretches and folds, get your dough into your bulk proofing containers. Once it's at double, pre-shape it, let it rest for 30 minutes, shape it, get it into your whatever baking vessel you're using, shape it first, score it, then get it into whatever baking vessel you're using and bake it same day. And this is just going to help you get practice for the processes. So here's my dough. It's nice and shaggy, right? So we've got all of our ingredients in there. We've mixed them all up. And I just want to show you something important that will help you understand what stretching and folding does and what it feels like when it's done. So right now, all I'm doing is just kind of gently mixing my dough together. I'm almost doing sort of like a kneading movement. But as I'm doing it, the dough is like completely sticking to my hands, right? During your first stretch and fold, when you do that stretch and fold, you can actually pull your dough and it'll stretch like this much and it'll rip and it'll fall apart and it'll stick to your hands. By the end of that first stretch and fold, the dough will actually be resisting you. You'll pull and it won't come up that high and it'll actually stick to your hand less. By the 4th set of stretch and folds, your dough will be smooth, elastic. It'll still be very sticky, but it won't be sticking to your hands like this, and it won't be sticking to the bowl as much. It'll be sticking to itself. What stretching and folding is doing is building the gluten structures together. Right now, they're all just kind of a sticky, nasty mess, right? But as we go, we start encouraging those fibers to intertwine with each other. It's a very important step. I highly recommend that you do it. I know that there's recipes out there that work without it, but it's a really good thing to practice as a beginner for sourdough. So what I'm going to do now is let this dough rest for 30 minutes and then do my first stretch and fold. So it's 6:24. My first stretch and fold is going to be at 5 to 7. At 7 o'clock, I'm going live on Starcam. This is where, if you want, you could come join me and you can actually ask questions directly. You can upload text or video questions that are like super specific to whatever's going on with you, and we can play them and everybody can see them and we can go through them and troubleshoot them together. So I hope you'll come. It's starcam.com/app. The app is free. I'm just starting to get used to it. This is my 3rd week and I've committed to going live every Monday. So I'm going to refeed my starter before we go. So at the beginning of this live, I showed you the starter was nice and bubbly. Now I have hardly any left. That's maybe 25 or 30 grams. I use a rescued deli jar. I use a tightly sealed lid. I'm in the sealed lid camp. I do not believe that a starter needs yeast from the air. I believe that using a sealed lid prevents mold and fruit flies. Not all starters with loose lids get mold, but the vast majority of mold posts that we troubleshoot in the Big Sourdough for Beginners group did have a loose or breathable lid. If your starter jar is big enough, if it's at least triple the size of as big as your starter gets when you feed it, then you don't have to worry about the lid popping or overflowing, and then you can seal the lid. Like I said, I'll post like the common starter questions, the starter playlist on YouTube, the beginner bread recipe, everything that we're talking about here in the live. I'll post them in the comments as soon as this live ends. And of course, you can always ask questions. So I'm going to take my starter. I've pre-measured 100 grams of flour. So what I did was I used 200 grams in my recipe. I'm now going to refeed my starter what I used. So I'm going to do 100 grams of flour, which I had pre-measured just because I'm in a bit of a rush today. I want to make sure I'm ready for the live Q&A at 7. And now I'm going to add 100 grams of water. Quick note, if you measure by cups instead of using a scale, remember that water is approximately twice as heavy as flour. So if you're using half a cup to feed your starter, then you want to use a quarter cup of water to feed your starter. So I'm just going to measure 100 grams of water in here. Pretty close. Here we go. Get that in. Cool. All right, so now I'm just going to stir this up. And like I said, because I bake frequently, I bake every 2 or 3 days max, sometimes every day. What I do with my starter is I feed it immediately after I'm done using it. I let it double on the counter. Once it's pretty close to peak, I stick it in the fridge. The fridge then slows that fermentation way down, and the starter stays at peak in the fridge. I'll show you. So this one was put in the fridge 2 days ago, and sort of that's the feed line. And you can see it's just sitting in the fridge at peak. So for me, what I do is I just pull my starter straight out of the fridge and measure it right into my bread. I don't let it come to room temperature, nothing. If you're going to go much more than 2 or 3 days, over time your starter will start to fall in the fridge. It is fermenting in there, just much more slowly. So a couple of ways to manage things are if you bake, once a week or once every 4 days or so, after you're done mixing, don't feed your starter, just stick it in the fridge and then pull it out for 12 hours, however long it takes your starter to double, feed it, leave it on the counter, wait for it to peak, and then use it. I find that feeding my starter before bed works just fine. I can mix in the morning. You don't have to use your starter exactly at peak. The longer past peak that you use it, the more flavor you're going to get in your bread. And then, of course, if you're a daily baker, then you can just feed your starter as soon as you're done mixing and leave it sitting on the counter and use it again the next day. So my starter's refed. My dough is mixed. I'm going to do my first stretch and fold at 5 to 7, and then at 7 o'clock I'll be live on Starcam. You can come there, ask any questions that you have. Once you get the Starcam app, as soon as you get in there, you'll see me, and you just click the event. I think you can actually even start uploading your questions now, like an hour before the event starts. So then at 7 o'clock when I come in, you'll be like first in line. So that's an option too. And then during that live, I'll continue to stretch and fold the dough. And depending on how long we stay on, I might even get the dough into the bulk proofing containers. So lots of you came in. Carlene, thank you so much for sending stars. That's so generous of you. I like it. I can see all of you here. If you've never seen me before, I'm Sarah. I started the Sourdough for Beginners group on Facebook. I use the Sourdough for Beginners page to get tutorials out there. I've got all the help that a beginner could need, and I try to focus on making things easy for you guys. So thanks for being here, and hopefully we'll see you at 7 in the live Q&A. Bye for now.